Hey everyone, and welcome back to the BFA class review. Today we're going to be doing the Druid, and once you're done with this video, check out Icy Veins. They've sponsored this whole series. They're the largest destination for World of Warcraft class guides, and they hired 26 writers for BFA. That's a lot of writers. Their guides are all up right now if you want to get familiar with any of these classes, learn what's happened, and how you can adapt to it. It's the place to go, and the link will be down in the description. So big thank you to them for sponsoring this series. And let's get right into the video. First up, Balance Druid. Balance was looking real bad during BFA Alpha, but Blizzard eventually implemented a design pass, bringing a number of changes to the spec, so let's hop right into it with the baseline changes. The largest thing to consider is Eclipse. So this gives Solar Wrath a 20% chance to generate a Lunar Empowerment, and Lunar Strike a 20% chance to generate a Solar Empowerment. Now, this is on top of the regular empowerment generation through the Star Surge ability, and it basically serves as a layer of unpredictability throughout the spec, which slightly varies how you play. Now, our empowerments are also a little bit different. Solar Empowerment makes your next Solar Wrath cleave targets. It reduces its cast time by 15% and increases damage by 10%. Then Lunar Empowerment increases the damage of Lunar Strike by 20% and decreases its cast time by 15%. Now our Mastery further buffs up these damage increases as well as increasing the damage of all of our dots. It actually no longer impacts the Stellar Empowerment effect from Legion because that has been removed. Now this was sort of a gameplay pain point for many druids, and its removal lets us do solid multi-target damage without always having to rely on our enemies being inside a Starfall. So there's a bit more flexibility there. Now that's pretty much it for the core stuff. Now of course we do lose our Artifact Weapon baseline, and its ability Moon is gone, but it is technically a talent, albeit not a very powerful one. But with that covered, let's just talk about the baseline gameplay here. So we're going to start by applying our Moonfire and Sunfire, which is the two dots. Note that Sunfire is an AoE application, but Moonfire has to be applied manually to all enemies. Once that's done, we need to start working on generating Astral Power, which is our main resource. Of course, we've got two main generators. We've got Solar Wrath, which has a shorter cast time and a single target. It's your basic filler and generator. And then, of course, it's got a 20% chance to generate a Lunar Empowerment, as I covered in the baseline changes section of the video. Then Lunar Strike is your other Astral Power generator. It has a 20% chance to generate a Solar Empowerment, and it also has a built-in cleave with its damage, so assuming you have no empowerments, you're going to be generating Astral Power with Lunar Strike if you're able to cleave with its damage, and you'll be using Solar Wrath if you cannot cleave with the Lunar Strike damage. Now, the empowerments are pretty simple. I've already covered what each one of them does, and each empowerment can stack up to 3 times. All of these Solar Wraths and Lunar Strikes, of course, they build up lots of power, Astral Power, and in single target situations, you put that into Star Surge, which does pretty good damage and generates both 1 Lunar and Solar Empowerment. It costs 40 Astral Power, and your Astral Power cap is 100, which means you can technically pull up and do 2 of them back to back. Now, in 3 target plus AoE, you'll be casting Starfall with your Astral Power. Now, with Star Surge and your generators, you want to be sure to never over-generate your empowerments. So, if you have 2 Solar Empowerments and 3 Lunar Empowerments, well, it would be a bad idea to cast a Solar one because it could generate a Lunar one, and of course, because 3 is the cap, if you already have 3, you would have lost or, wasted what you generated. So this means that you always want to alternate their casting, ensuring that you're never accidentally overcapping them. And that's pretty much it for the core of the spec. Basically, the Eclipse mechanic provides a lot it puts in a layer of unpredictability to the spec, prevents it from being as boring as it otherwise could have been. But with that covered, let's talk about the talents. So interestingly, we've only lost 2 talents, Blessing of the Ancients, which gave you some passive resources, and Displacer Beasts, which was your Druid Blink. Now, losing Displacer Beasts, that's kind of sad. Its replacement, Tiger Dash, yep, it gets the job done, but it's a bit slower. Now, we then do have 2 new Throughput talents. So, Twin Moons increases the damage of Moonfire by 20% and makes it hit another target. This is really good in AoE situations. Of course, Sunfire already applies in an AoE, and then Twin Moons will half the number of globals that you're putting into multi-dotting, which is quite nice. Then finally, New Moon has been added on the 100 tier. Of course, this brings back the, I think, very popular Legion era gameplay. However, It's not that competitively balanced currently, and really that's the risk of taking baseline functionality and turning it into a talent. Sure, you technically can use it, but realistically you might not feel like you're able to. Now, I still think that it just should be a baseline mechanic, to be completely honest. Now, there have been significant changes for other things, so Fury of Elune has been redesigned. It no longer is a targeted ground effect. It's now a dot that you apply to an enemy. It'll follow that enemy, dealing damage to enemies around it, and then generating you 40 astral power over its 8-second duration. Then Force of Nature now generates 20 astral power, and then Nature's Balance has actually been changed quite a lot. So previously, it would cause your fillers to extend the duration of your dots. Convenient, but at the cost of gameplay. It now gives you a passive astral power every 3 seconds, and it makes it so that you default to 50 AP outside of combat, which allows you to open combat with a Star Surge, instantly getting empowerments. Then Star-Lord has been redesigned, and this is awesome. So it now causes Star Surge and Starfall to give you a 3% haste buff for 20 seconds that stacks up to 3 times. But the catch is that getting stacks doesn't refresh the duration. That means that it's all about pulling up your astral power so that you can use 3 Star Surges as close together as is possible, therefore giving you the longest possible 9% haste buff. And I think that's just a really fun mechanic to be playing around, and I'm really glad they added it. Now, then Stellar Flare now generates astral power, but it's weak outside of pure single target. Warrior of Elune causes its instant Lunar Strikes to generate 40% more astral power, which is a big surge. And all of that's quite good, and I think it's about time we just round it off with opinions. So overall, I'm actually quite pleased with how Balance has turned out. Eclipse is fantastic for the spec, it makes the second-to-second gameplay a lot more interesting, and it adds a bit more room for failure when it comes to overgenerating your empowerments. Then the empowerments themselves are, they're a little bit more interesting, I suppose, especially putting some cleave into Solar Wrath. Now, when we look through the talents, there's some excellent picks like Star-Lord that's really fun, and the new Warrior of Elune provides a really satisfying burst of astral power. I think broadly, just putting more astral power generation into the talents is a great thing, especially if you are playing with Star-Lord where that AP really feels like super valuable. Currently Shooting Stars is good actually in 1 to 2 target situations, and it's kind of boring, while Fury of Elune is better for larger AoE, and New Moon sadly just is really weak right now. Playing with either of those things though, plus Star-Lord and Warrior of Elune, is really fun, so I hope Blizzard kind of rebalances some of that a little bit. Overall though, and from an admittedly rather casual perspective, I am very happy with what's happened to Balance, although there is room for improvement with how they balance up the talents. Still, I think it's actually a really great spec with a lot of great mechanics, especially once you get into the talents and start playing around Star-Lord, so I'm thinking it's going to get a thumbs up from me for BFA. And next we venture over to the Feral Druid. They're in an interesting spot with Legion, with dot snapshotting and sort of plate spinning gameplay of, your bleeds and your blood towns really being the king until 7.3 rebalance things, reducing the performance delta between the most difficult and most accessible versions of the spec. Now there are still some changes, but given how it got a lot of attention quite recently, Battle for Azeroth doesn't really look to change the Feral Druid that much on paper. So let's talk about the baseline changes, and the largest change to Feral is the game-wide change to bleeds and haste. In Battle for Azeroth, the tick rate of bleeds now increases with your haste. Note that the duration of the damage over time effect is the same, and the damage per tick is the same. Just you get more ticks. That means that having increased haste is a flat-out damage boost to your bleeds, and that is something that is extremely important for a spec like Feral, which relies on them very heavily for damage. Then Tiger's Fury now lasts 2 seconds longer and generates 10 fewer energy, and thankfully is not on global cooldown, which is something we were all very scared of during beta. But past that, and rather astoundingly, no real ability changes or removals. All that's really changed is we've now gained Hibernate, which is a sleep for beasts and Dragonkin, and then Soothe, which dispels enrage effects. Okay, maybe that was a bit of a lie to say there were no removals. Of course, we have lost our artifact weapon ability baseline, and of course the traits from the weapon. Now, this stuff does cause a decrease in the pace of the spec, which does mean slower energy and combo point generation. Definitely, I would say it's quite noticeable when combined with the usual start of an expansion decrease in your secondary stats, and this has had the effect of shifting our damage further towards bleeds, and that's because the percentage of our time spent is, the percentage of time spent that goes towards maintaining bleeds is a bit higher because we've got less combo point overflow for our bite. Now, our artifact ability was another big source of combo points. That's now gone baseline, however, it has been worked into a talent option. Then the artifact also makes Berserk, our main cooldown, frankly, kind of terrible in terms of power. So, there you go, that's the baseline changes, so let's talk about the gameplay. We, like the rogues, use energy and combo points. Now, we've got two generators of combo points. We've got Shred, which is a simple melee attack that generates a combo point, and Rake, which is a bleed that also generates a combo point. So the two of these generate CP, but where does it go into? Well, Rip is a combo point spender that applies a really powerful dot to the enemy, and basically maintaining its uptime is just super important. Then you've got Ferocious Bite, which is just a straight up instant damage melee combo point spender that is used to burn off excess combo points. Now, the interaction between all of these abilities essentially just forms the core of this spec's gameplay. Then, of course, in AoE, you're mixing in Swipe and maintaining Thrash, which is your big AoE bleed. Now, Tiger's Fury is an extremely important ability, so it's got a 30-second cooldown, and it's off the global cooldown. It generates 50 energy, and it will increase all damage you deal by 15% for 10 seconds. Now, this effect is extremely important because it is snapshotted by your damage over time effects. What does this mean? Well, if you use Tiger's Fury and then a few seconds later you use Rip, well, the usage of that Rip will benefit from the 15% damage increase of Tiger's Fury for the full duration of Rip. That means that as much as possible you want to use Rip and Rake while the Tiger's Fury buff is active. Now, this snapshotting mechanic is extremely important to playing the Feral Druid well, and we're going to see even more snapshotting later on. But before I move into the talents, I want to fill you in on a few passives. So Omen of Clarity gives our auto attacks a chance to make our next Shred, Thrash, or Swipe, cost no energy. Then Primal Fury causes direct damage crits to generate an extra combo point. That's still good in BFA, but it's a bit weaker because of the loss of crit from some artifact traits. And then finally, Predatory Swiftness causes your Entangling Roots, Rebirth, or Regrowth to be free, and it has a 20% proc rate per combo point spent, meaning that using a finisher at 5 CP guarantees a proc of it. This will become important later. So that's pretty much it for the core gameplay. With all that covered, let's do talents. So first up, like all the Druid specs, we've lost Displacer Beast, which is now replaced with Tiger Dash. We have then lost Elune's Guidance, which was a combo point generating cooldown. Elune's Guidance has been replaced, though, with Feral Frenzy. Now, Feral Frenzy is essentially your old artifact weapon ability, just that it now generates 5 combo points, up from 3, and has a lower cooldown, so that's pretty great. Now, there are some other minor tweaks, but that's just about it. The major change here is that part of the point of the recent, or the Legion Feral Druid changes later on in Legion, that's kind of been reverted because of how Blood Talons now interacts with the changes to bleeds and haste, plus how Jagged Wounds, which causes your bleeds to bleed out faster but for the same damage, is now a very strong talent. So Blood Talons was always seen as being quite hard to use, so Blizzard rebalanced the talents such that it was still excellent, but not by such a large margin. Well, that is now no longer the case, it would seem. Blood Talons is another dot snapshotting talent. What it does is it causes Regrowth and Entangling Roots to cause your next 2 melee attacks to deal 25% increased damage for their full duration. Now, you're able to get that instant Regrowth, of course, through Predatory Swiftness, which I mentioned earlier, or is it Omen of Clarity? Omen of Clarity, never mind. And that effect happens 100% of the time when you use a 5 combo point spender. What that means is that your goal is to have every damage over time effect snapshotted with Tiger's Fury, as much as is possible, and then also with Blood Talons. These two mechanics come together to create one of the most difficult to play specs in the game, with its playstyle. Like, it doesn't only require solid planning and understanding to pull off, but it requires excellent execution. Then the main reason why it's so powerful in Battle for Azeroth, of course, is that bleeds now scale with haste, as I mentioned earlier, which is really important. So it's really satisfying to get right, but it's definitely not friendly to new players, I would say. Especially if you're also talented into Savage Roar, which requires upkeep, though do note that the damage increase from Savage Roar does not snapshot, it just dynamically updates, so the skill cap is not as high as it could be. Now, if you don't particularly care about being the best in the world, then running around with Brutal Slash and Moment of Clarity in, say, a Mythic Dungeon, that's still great fun, and it does somewhat take the pressure off executing the Blood Talons mechanic perfectly, so I'd say the talent tree does provide good gameplay and difficulty choice, but that choice decreases as you move on to more demanding content where you feel more of a pressure to choose mathematically the best option. So let's move on to opinions. I suspect that the experienced Feral Druids will be pretty happy with all of this stuff, but the newer Feral Druids may not be, although that does depend on one's goals and personal preferences. For me, I really do enjoy Blood Talons on a patchwork-styled boss that's very simple, but as soon as there's more stuff going on, to be honest with you, I just want a class that is not as mechanically taxing so that I can focus more on the fight itself. And this brings up the age-old problem of balance and difficulty. A Blood Talons and Savage Roar Druid is going to be a harder spec to play than a Havoc Demon Hunter, but insofar as how game balance goes, they've got to do roughly the same amount of damage. That very much means that Feral, it is not the path of least resistance, even though it is very enjoyable to play, and certainly is very satisfying to do well in the long run. So that's always something to juggle in your head when you're trying to decide what spec to go with. What I will say is the Brutal Slash Omen of Clarity build is super, it's simple, fun, slashy. I kind of enjoy it actually. And as for the Blood Talons one, I probably could get used to it. So Feral, it does get a thumbs up for me, but it's just a bit of a tentative one with a few caveats. Right, next up, the Guardian Druid. I've got to be honest with you, this was my least favorite tanking spec in Legion. Now look, it totally worked. It got the job done, but I just did not find it to have a unifying gameplay identity. Instead, it just had a pretty simple DPS rotation with a bunch of defensive cooldowns seemingly bolted on. So let's see what Battle for Azeroth changes. Yeah, there's not much. So you lose your artifact and its ability, which does mean you've got one less defensive cooldown. Past that, we see a bunch of, I'd say, under the hood changes. So Iron Fur now scales its armor based on your agility, which gives agility more of a defensive value. This is a bit like what we saw on the Vengeance Demon Hunter, and I suppose, yeah, it's pretty welcome. Then Frenzied Generation has been changed. It now heals you for a flat, I believe, 18% of your maximum health, making usage of it being, I'd say, a little bit more flexible than it was during Legion. However, its cooldown has been increased from 24 seconds to 36 seconds. Past that, we are mostly just subject to the new wave of Battle for Azeroth tank changes, particularly the changes to mob management, where tanks no longer generate as much threat when compared to DPS players. We still do generate 4 times more threat per damage that we deal, but this does mean we need to pay a bit more attention to mobs, and as I always say, this will likely be no issue at all for experienced tanks, but for newer tanks it might be a little bit, trickier. There might be some teething pains. But that basically is it for the baseline changes, so let's talk about gameplay. And the gameplay is pretty much the same. So you've got your basic damage rotation where the goal is to generate rage, either for use offensively or defensively, and of course to generate threat on mobs as well. So Mangle is our main single target rage generator. It's got a 6-second cooldown, it generates 8 rage, and it deals 20% more damage to bleeding enemies. Okay, so we want our enemies to be bleeding because of that, and we do that with Thrash. This is an area of effect attack that will put a 15-second bleed on all targets within 8 yards. This bleed can then stack up to 3 times on targets, and Thrash generates 5 rage on a 6-second cooldown, which makes it pretty easy to maintain its bleed. So then we just want to use those 2 things in cooldown, and then use our filler spell, Swipe. It just does AoE damage, generates no rage, spends no rage. If I was being snarky, I'd say this is evidence of Blizzard not being able to craft an engaging central combat mechanic for its offensive rotation. But anyway, doing these things, overall generate some rage. So what do we do with that rage? Really simple. If we want to deal damage, then we put it into Maul. Now, Maul does pretty decent single target damage at the expense of 45 rage. Then if you want to use your rage for a defensive value, you use Iron Fur, which is our main mitigation mechanic. Now, like Maul, it costs 45 rage, but it will increase, and it will increase your armor by 75% of your agility for 7 seconds. Importantly though, and this is the more interesting thing, it actually overlaps on multiple uses. This means that if you're expecting a large burst of physical damage, you should pull up to 90 rage, allowing for 2 overlapped Iron Furs to be used to mitigate that damage. Now, it's important to say that using Iron Fur twice, it doesn't give you 2 stacks of a single buff. It will give you 2 buffs, each with their own independent 7-second duration, which means that if you use it back to back, they'll overlap for 5 or 6 seconds. So yeah, there's that. Right, then we have Frenzied Generation. It only costs 10 rage. It will heal you for 18% of your max health over 3 seconds. Past that, we've got 2 defensive cooldowns. We've got Bark Skin, which is a flat 20% damage taken reduction, and Survival Instincts. Now, this has 2 charges, a 4-minute recharge, and it reduces all damage taken by a tremendous 50%. This makes it extremely powerful. Now we do also have some important procs to understand. We've got Gore. This gives your offensive abilities a chance to reset the cooldown of Mangle and make your next Mangle generate 4 extra rage. This does make an otherwise extremely bland ability like Swipe at least count for something, I suppose. And really that's basically it for the Guardian Druid. Essentially, you generate rage, you don't want to overspend it, you want to use Iron Fur to survive through basic stuff, use Frenzied Regen to help the healers out, and use your big cooldowns for when you know you're about to be pummeled. The main difference really from BF8 Legion is that you've lost your artifact ability, which was yet another defensive cooldown, and then of course the global cooldown change, which impacts your defensive cooldowns. So let's talk about talents. And once again, we see a Druid spec with minimal changes to their talents. Guttural Roars is gone, now being replaced with Tiger Dash. And that's it. My job was pretty damn simple this time, so let's just talk about some of the more impactful talents for the gameplay, because there are some that deserve being called out. Bristling Fur gives you another cooldown. It will cause you to generate rage based on damage taken for 8 seconds on a 45-second cooldown. Now this is pretty cool because you use it before you take heavy damage, which will allow you to build up your rage bar pretty quickly after sinking it, say, into some Iron Furs. As for the rest of the talent tree, for the most part, I can't say that I find it amazingly engaging bar select few options. So there's Incarnation Guardian of Ursoc, which is a pretty fun ability because it increases the gameplay speed in your rage regen, which is kind of cool. Then Guardian of Elune is also quite fun. It causes Mangle to increase the duration of your next Iron Fur or the healing of your next Frenzied Regen. And I typically enjoy mechanics like this as they kind of reward a little bit of thought and pacing and planning, and that can be pretty satisfying in the long run. Then in addition to that, it does add just a little bit of rhythm to the spec, which I think is quite welcome. Finally, we've got Pulverize. Now this is a cool talent. So it is an attack that consumes 2 stacks of Thrash's Bleed on the enemy in order to do heavy damage, and then also reduce your damage taken by 9% for 20 seconds. So that's kind of something to maintain and build up, which is quite fun. The rest of the talents though, they're all fine, they're often competitive, but from a design and fun perspective, those are the ones that stand out. Thankfully, Pulverize and Guardian of Elune are both competitive picks, making the best version of Guardian one that I can happily play. So what are my opinions on this spec? Well, even though there are some strong talents, I've got to admit, I find this spec boring. It just doesn't feel like it has a unifying gameplay feel. Now, think about how Brewmaster has its Monk mechanic, how Blood Decay is about regen, how Vengeance has its Soul Fragment mechanic. It's no wonder that they are my preferred tank specs. It feels like there's a bit of meta gameplay going on with them past just the, the raw ability usage. I suppose with Guardian, Protection Warrior, and Protection Paladin, to me, they feel a bit plain in comparison, with Guardian being the most plain of those 3. So look, it gets the job done, it absolutely works. It's maybe a little bit less good than it was in Legion because of the talent removal. Otherwise though, I'd say, yeah, it's fine, it's just a bit dull. And then finally, for this mammoth video, we've got Restoration. Now, Resto was in a pretty good spot with Legion, and we've got pretty good news for the King of Hots. Blizzard are not massively changing things up in BFA, so let's talk about the baseline changes. Okay, let's get into the baseline changes. So, Healing Touch has been removed from the spec, which is probably long overdue because the ability has kind of long fallen out of favor, really. We then have a modified Regrowth to make up for that, with Regrowth having a reduced mana cost and increased heal over time. Well, that's partially to make up for the removal of Living Seed. Basically, Blizzard they've essentially consolidated these abilities, which, you know what's a pretty welcome change in my book. Then Wild Growth has had a slight mana cost reduction, and Tranquility has had a pretty interesting change where it now has a stacking heal over time from its ticks. Then Iron Bark is down to a 1-minute cooldown, and Swift Mend is down to a 25-second cooldown from 30. Not groundbreaking changes, but they certainly are quite nice. Now, the loss of Artifact Weapon is felt in a few cases, with the only really noticeable ones being the loss of our Rejuvenation duration increase, and the Trank is no longer castable while moving. However, I suppose Trank has otherwise been buffed. Finally, our artifact ability is actually saved. It's now integrated into the Flourish talent. So that's it for the main changes. Let's hop on over to covering the resultant gameplay. So our basic gameplay is pretty much unchanged. You're going to be spreading Rejuvenation, which is your instant heal over time. That will keep people topped up. You'll then be maintaining Life Bloom, which is your heal over time, though that can only be used in one target, so normally slap it on the tank. It does a decent amount of healing, and if it expires, is refreshed by Pandemic window, or is dispelled, you will instantly heal the target. So that's pretty great. Now, you want to keep all that rolling, but it's not going to be enough to keep people alive, so let's talk about the direct heals. Regrowth heals the target up front and then leaves a hot on them over time. We then have Swift Mend. This is a pretty beefy instant cast heal that can be a total lifesaver. So that's the core single target kit. Let's talk about AoE, where we have two options past spreading Rejuve. So Effervescence just puts a bunch of mushrooms on the floor that will heal people, so if you see the mushroom, stand near the mushroom. Then Wild Growth is our big one. It puts a hot on 6 injured allies. Now, it's a hot that starts ticking really high initially and then decreases over time, which means that its healing is more upfront than most. Past that, though, we have 3 cooldowns. We've got Tranquility, Tree of Life, and Flourish. 2 of those are talented, though. So Trank is a massive heal that leaves a hot on allies. Flourish will extend and to speed up your hots, and then Tree of Life gives you a 15% healing increase and empowers most of your spells, most importantly Rejuve and Wild Growth. That's pretty much it, though. I think we actually just need to check out the talents for the full picture. And once again, a surprising lack of changes. Displacer Beast, of course, is now Tiger Dash, as we would expect. Then Moment of Clarity is gone in favor for Photosynthesis. This is a new talent that gives you extra options with Life Bloom. It's pretty cool, so if you cast Life Bloom on yourself, then the rest of your hots will heal 15% faster. However, if you cast it on an ally, then your hots on that ally will give it a 5% chance to bloom. It's a pretty cool effect, actually, though the latter effect is kind of inconsistent in comparison to putting Life Bloom on yourself, which I thought was a bit curious. So that's new on the 100 tier, but it's actually a little bit weak right now, and it's not really used. The other 2 talents are big, though. So we've got Germination, and Germination, of course, lets you put 2 Rejuves on a target, and then we've got Flourish, which extends the duration of all of your hots and increases their healing rate by 100% for 8 seconds, which effectively bakes your artifact weapon ability into that button. The thing here, though, is that we actually have to choose between these effects, because Germination has been moved to the 100 tier, and it's kind of sad to see this ultra powerful and I think very satisfying combination no longer be possible. However, I can understand why they would do this, because the combination risks being so powerful to the point where it's the only right option. And then another nice part of Flourish is that it now has a synergy with Tranquility. So as I said, Tranquility now leaves a hot on people. Well, that hot can have its duration extended and its healing rate doubled by Flourish, which is a really cool synergy. In terms of other things, though, there's not too much, so I just want to flag up some designs that I like. One of them is Soul of the Forest. It causes Swift Mend to buff your next Regrowth or Rejuve by 200%, or your next Wild Growth by 75%. I really enjoy using this talent, but sadly, it's really quite weak, with most going for either Cultivation or Tree of Life in that tier. Now, when it would be combined with Prosperity, which gives you 2 charges of Swift Mend, I think that would be a really fun gameplay combo, but right now, it's just not really viable. So with the talents covered, though, let's talk about opinions. Restoration makes it into BFA pretty much unscathed. Indeed, it has received a buff to Trank's healing through a nice hot. It's got a nice consolidation of abilities and effects through the new Regrowth. Personally, I'm a little bit unhappy to see that the talents that I really enjoy are not that viable, and that the fun of Germination and Flourish being combined isn't there. But that said, the new Flourish is fantastic, and I'm really happy that they baked artifact ability into it. Overall, I would say that Resto Druid gameplay is very similar to what you know. It has received some welcome changes as well. So yeah, I think, it's really strong, really fun. If you enjoy hot-based gameplay, it absolutely is a great healer pick for you. And then let's round it off with the overall thoughts on Druids. So I think the first thing is, as always, they are a remarkably flexible class. They cover every role in the game, and every spec will do its job absolutely well. Balance is a pretty solid spec, though to me, maybe not as exciting as, say, Fire Mage. Feral is brilliant on paper, with Blood Talents being a really difficult and satisfying mechanic, but I actually think I would enjoy the game more on another spec, like Windwalker or Survival Hunter, because they, for me, provide a better balance of mechanics from your class to mechanics from the encounter that I think is a bit more fun. Then Restoration continues to be a very enjoyable one for me, although I do wish that Soul of the Forest was a bit more viable, as, I enjoyed using that a lot back in WoD. As for Guardian, well, I still think it's the most boring tank in the game, and really, it's as simple as that. overall, I can recommend Druid if you really like the shape-shifting fantasy and want a broad selection of choices. I'd say that its specs are average to above average in terms of ranking within their role, so I wouldn't really recommend a Druid to someone who truly wants to main one of its specs. But that said, if the theme of being a Druid is really something that appeals to you, and the idea of being able to fill any role is anything that really, really appeals to you, then yeah, I think the Druid absolutely is up your alley, and especially if the gameplay that I covered in this video is the sort of thing that you think you would enjoy. So there you go, that's my thoughts on the Druid in Battle for Azeroth. Of course, this video is sponsored by Icy Veins. You can check out their Druid guides and all of their other class guides in the description down below. I recommend you do that, it'll really get you up to speed pretty quickly. But yeah, that's it. That's it for me. That's actually it for the initial class review series of Battle for Azeroth. I'll probably do some roundup videos, to rank everything. But yeah, there you go. That is my thoughts on the Druid. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.